So then, now we've made our first API request to get the city information and, more importantly, this key for the city. Now then, the second API call we need to make is for the current conditions, or the weather if you like, and that's the current conditions API, and it's this endpoint at the top. So this is the resource URL, or the endpoint if you like, and notice at the end right here we have this little code. Now that code is exactly this thing we get back. So when we're making a request for some current conditions, we put that code directly in the resource URL. It's not a query parameter, it's in the resource URL directly. So this represents a single location right here. Now we don't have to put it in curly braces as they do here, that's just showing us that this is some kind of variable. But we place our city code right there. And the only query parameter we need is the API key right here. So I could test this, but instead what I'm going to do is just directly do this inside the code. So we now need a second function to get the weather information. And in fact, let me just do a comment here to say get city information. And we'll do another comment now to say get weather information. And we'll do our function underneath this. So this time const get weather, and set it equal to an async function again, because again we're using the fetch API inside it. We want this function to return a promise, and inside this function we need to pass in the key that we get back here. So let's have a look at this. We get the key on this property, key with a capital K, and I'm not imagining that capital K this time, it is actually a capital K. So we could get that from this data when we get it back and pass it in here. So let's take in a key and we'll call that an ID. It's a location ID at the end of the day, but you can call it what you want. So the first thing we want to do in here is something similar to this. We want to sort out our base and our query. So the base is going to be this thing over here. Let me grab that all the way up to V1. So just copy all of this stuff like so and go back over here and we'll paste that. So we'll say const base is this time equal to this stuff. Now we want to also do the query section. So we'll say const query is equal to something as well. Now I said a minute ago that the actual key, the location key, isn't part of the query parameter, and it's not. But instead of adding it directly here, I like to add it on the query part anyway. So directly after this, we need to output the ID. That's how it works, right? We have this ID directly after V1. So let me output this ID first of all using template strings. So get rid of those normal quotes and we'll use template strings instead. Then we do $ curly braces to output a variable, and we want to output the ID, which is ultimately going to be this thing that we get back right here when we make our first request. So that's the first part. The second thing we need is the API key. So we need to say question mark, because now it's the beginning of our query parameters, because remember this is not a query parameter but the API key is. So API key all lowercase, and that is going to be equal to this thing at the top, again the same key, so we can output that using $ curly braces and then key. And that's all there is to it now. We have the base and the query. Now we want to do the same thing as down here. We want to fetch this resource and combine these together inside the fetch. So let's say const response is now equal to await, because we want to await this promise until it resolves. Then fetch, inside we want the base plus the query. So now we're fetching this resource, returns a promise, we're awaiting that promise until it resolves, then we get the response object right here. So we have that response object, and now we can get the data from it by saying const data is equal to await again. Then we want to get the response object and use .json, which returns a promise. So we're waiting for this promise to resolve right here. Then we're returning the value to this thing. So again, what I'm going to do is just console.log the data right here. Now we need to call this thing with some kind of ID or key. So let me just, for now, comment this out, get city, because we don't want to make that request, but instead we want to make the get weather request. And we need to pass some kind of ID or key through here. So let's just pass the one that we get back from here. So let's grab that thing, copy it, and paste it inside here. So save it, and let's see if this works. And now we can see we get this array back, but it has an object inside it, just a single object. And this is the weather information about that area. So we have weather text, cloudy. We have some temperature information right here. We can see, is it daytime? Has precipitation? We get a lot of information about this location. So then we could use that to output that information right here. But before we do that, let's just hook all this up together, because we don't want to just make a random call to this key code right here. We want to make a request for a particular location using actual words like this, Manchester. Then when we get the data back from this, we can use the key on that request to make that request, the second one, for the weather inside this then method. So let me do all this. Let me now uncomment all of this stuff. Oh, and by the way, we should return the data right here. So let's say return data. And again, it was in an array. There was only one object in that array, but we'll return that object rather than the array. So we have that and it's easier to use later on. So that's what we're returning right here for the weather. Now, what we're doing is making a request for the city, Manchester at the minute. Then when it resolves, we're getting the data back right here, which is that first object in the array. At the minute, we're just logging that to the console, but instead, what we want to do inside this function is something else. We want to take the key off that data. Remember, we have a key on that data. That's that little code. And then we want to pass that into a request for this thing right here. So inside this, we could say instead, return get weather and pass in the key that we get from this. And that is data.key with a capital K. So we're getting the key from the response of this request right here when we get the data, and we're passing that into get weather. Remember, this returns a promise and we're returning it right here, which means we can chain these things together. So I could then say .then right here. Before I do that, I'm just going to neaten this up a little bit. I'm going to put this on the first line and I'm going to scoot all of this over to the left, and I'll just say .then right here. So this is going to fire a callback function when this thing is resolved, and we get that data in here, which will be this right here. I hope that all makes sense. First we're doing get city, we get the data, then we're doing get weather, passing in the key from that data. This returns a promise. When that's resolved, we return the whole thing right here. So this is all a promise, and when it's resolved, this data is passed into a callback function which fires, and inside here we can do something. For now, we're just going to say console.log the data, which is the data we get back from the weather API. So let me now put the catch up there so it looks a little neater. Let me now test this. So now we should make this request and it should give us the weather data in the console. Save it and come over here, and now we can see an object with that weather data, a weather icon, the temperature, the weather text, and is it daytime, etc. All of that stuff. So now we have all that, we can start to hook up the functionality with our application so that when we type something in here, it actually makes this request.